All right, well, let's have a word of prayer. Father, thank you very much for the day. Thank you for this conference. Lord, it packs a lot in a little bit, and it is a stretch for the dear folks of this church, and we appreciate it, and we're very grateful for those that travel, many of them, many miles, to come to take part in it, and we pray, Lord, you bless each one. Lord, we pray that you would bless our time together as we talk about the subject of working on the side and the pitfalls and maybe some how-tos of it, that you bless our time in your word and some discussion, and that you would be honored and glorified in our midst. We pray that you'd work in each situation to provide for your people, to provide for your men and their families, and that, Lord, we would all honor you in it and how we handle it. We pray it in Christ's name. Amen. All right. If you didn't get it, there's a handout right here. I'm going to take one and pass it. It's one page front and back. For the camera, I'm Pastor Nate Hayman from Pilgrim Baptist Church in North Brookfield, Massachusetts. That's pretty much in the middle of that, Massachusetts. And I have been there for 13 years as a bivocational minister. That's a fancy name for a person of a divided heart. And we're going to talk about that a little this afternoon. I was going to do a PowerPoint, which in here and with 3 students would be just as silly as it sounds. But the whole point of the PowerPoint was the first 2 slides. Slide number 1, tip number 1 about bivocational ministry is don't do it. And then I was going to, after a moment, switch to slide number 2. Tip number 2, wasn't kidding. It's not God's ideal. Your health, physically, emotionally, spiritually, your family's health, your church's health. I have been at this, I've done it in other times in my ministry. I've done it 13 years where I am, and I've paid a dear price in my family. My home is, half of my downstairs is bare drywall. It's been that way for 5 years, 6 years, parts of it. I'm so behind, Calvin and Hobbes had a cartoon, God put me on earth to accomplish a certain number of things. I'm so far behind I'll never die. That's where I am. But people say, Pastor Hayman, I don't know how you do it all. And the simple fact of the matter is, I don't do it all. And some of you brothers are here that have as much or more experience in this as I, and something gets shorted. Probably more often than not, we short ourselves, we short our families, we short our wives, but you can't do it all at once. I remember I had a couple in my first full-time church, and older couple, and they found that I understood the doctor a little better than they did, and so they started dragging me with them to the doctor all the time and to interpret. And I remember the doctor explaining it as if he was a juggler, and that this brother had 3 health concerns going on, and he could make 2 of them happy at once. So he was always going to have to let something go by the wayside. My view of bivocational ministry is, to one degree or another, it does that, and the goal really is to diminish it, and I think the goal needs to be to work ourselves out of one of those jobs. That's really the approach and tack that I'll take today. Some do's and some don'ts, and it starts with don'ts. Don't do it. If you can avoid it, don't do it. And some reasons for that. Don't use bivocational approach to avoid living within your means. Some people work 2 jobs because it's pretty handy. You can fudge it on Sunday. I've sat in conferences with wonderful speakers, and I've watched people cut and paste from the internet and put a sermon together. You can fudge it, and you can get away with it at least for a period of time. You can go out and you can get paid for doing secular work, even while you're being paid for doing ministry work at the same time, and double dip, and it's tempting. But the bigger thing is to spend in regard to what you actually make. Most of the things you'd read in articles or online financial blogs and so forth about whether your wife should go to work or not apply here. Does your extra work mean that you eat out too often? Do you have to pay to keep up 2 cars when maybe you could have done it with 1? Are you paying people to do things for you that you normally could have done for yourself if you'd had the time? Do you find yourself giving your kids extra treats or gifts to make up for shorting them on your time? Do you take them out to ice cream? Do you take them out for donuts? For that Dunkin' Donuts coffee that puts every Massachusetts resident in the poorhouse? Are you doing those things because you're not budgeting? Are you working on the side because you're not budgeting, you're not living within your means? We need to be very careful that we're not doing it because we're not being discipline to live within our means. Don't use a bivocational approach to avoid having difficult conversations at church. Some of my history is my predecessor, bought his house in 1970 for $14,000. I bought mine in 2006, and it cost me considerably more than $14,000.
Put a 1 in front of that, probably.
A 1.
2.
Measured by 20.
Oh my.
Or multiplied by 20. That's kind of how that worked. We bought at the tip of the boom. We bought a couple towns over from where our church is, and we still got clobbered. We need to teach our people the whole counsel of God, and that includes 1 Corinthians 9. If you've got your Bible and you turn with me there at 1 Corinthians 9. Paul defends his apostleship beginning in verse 1. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. My defense to those who examine me is this: do we not have a right to eat and drink? Do we not have a right to take along a believing wife, even as the rest of the apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or do only Barnabas and I not have the right to refrain from working? Who at any time serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat the fruit of it? Or who tends a flock and does not use the milk of the flock? I am not speaking these things according to human judgment, am I? Or does not the law also say these things? Verse 9, for it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle the ox while he is threshing. God is not concerned about oxen, is he? Or is he speaking altogether for our sake? Yes, for our sake it was written, because the plowman ought to plow in hope, and the thresher to thresh in hope of sharing the crops. If we sowed spiritual things in you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share the right over you, do we not more? Nevertheless, we did not use this right, but we endure all things so that we will cause no hindrance to the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who perform sacred services eat the food of the temple, and those who attend regularly to the altar have their share from the altar? So also the Lord directed those who proclaim the gospel to get their living from the gospel. I think our problem is that when we teach this, especially depending on how our church has been taught in the past and what their history is, too often we hurry to verse 15, where Paul says, but I have used none of these things, and I am not writing these things so that it will be done so in my case, for it would be better for me to die than to have any man make my boast an empty one. And he goes on to say why he preaches and why he is the famous tent maker from whom we get that phrase. People jump to it and say, well, Paul might have said this, but this isn't what Paul did. So it shouldn't be what you do either, Pastor, or what I should do either as a pastor. The fact of the matter is, Paul was a unique man in a unique time. And so here in the guidance of the Holy Spirit of God, with all the authority of the rest of the Word, he says, verse 14, the Lord directed those who proclaimed the gospel to get their living from the gospel. That is God's ideal. That is God's clear teaching. And we ought to be there, or we ought to be working our way towards it.
That word ordained is presumably a powerful word, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
It is. It's to me it pinpoints it and gives us no wiggle. This is really what his plan for us is. We need to teach people that 1 Corinthians 9 principle. That's what God has. Sometimes it gets awful practical, the muzzle the ox who's threshing. We had a very large funeral in our church this past week. It was an all hands on deck kind of a thing. And my wife and I have been absolutely straight out the last couple of weeks. It's just sometimes it's hard and sometimes it goes off the charts, and this was one of those weeks. And Tuesday night we left a funeral viewing at about 7:30. Went to church to unload a whole carload of food from BJ's for the dinner after the funeral the next day. And we realized that our only chance of eating dinner was to make ourselves sandwiches, which we ate in our cars as we drove home. So we took from the funeral food. There you have it. It's admitted. And I claimed that verse, don't muzzle the ox while he's threshing. I actually even confessed it to a couple of deacons who smiled with me because they understood exactly how our week had been. I think we need to have patience I think it's important to us that we not try to rush something. I mentioned here in a moment, we really need to have ideally to have an advocate. I have an uncle who was a national director for an educational foundation for years. I mean, he made what to us would be really good money, but for years he didn't make anything near what his peers in similar positions made, until he got one man on his board after probably 15 or 20 years of having the job. He got one man who knew differently, who'd served on another board, and he brought a comparison of how the other people who were paid, who had that job and had those responsibilities and traveled the world like that, and they rapidly upped his salary. Pastors dream of somebody like that, who will come and say to the church, hey, we have the wherewithal, we should be taking care of this pastor, or that's not enough. And there's several things to encouraging your people in that regard. The very first is to be patient with them. Enlist outside help. Talk to your NRBFC representative. If I could pan that camera, he's sitting here. And he ought to be teaching this class because he's far better at this subject than I am. But talk to your NRBFC rep, talk to your local fellowship reps, if they will speak up for you. I give you the link for Stewardship Services Foundation. Brother Jim Rickard has been doing this for 35, 40 years probably in one form or another, helping pastors with their taxes and churches with their finances. I speak about them a little bit more later, but they have been a big help to us. They can be a big help to you. Again, if somebody else will speak for you, that's all the better. Have an advocate that will bring things up. If you try to make them understand it all on your own, you're going to look like a money grubber. That's just kind of how it goes. And so you need to have somebody who's going to speak up on your behalf and do that for you.
And can I jump in with an illustration?
Please.
In a deacons meeting this past year, one of the senior retired men stated the difference in cost of living of his time versus now. He understood the principle of the house cost this much in my years, and he stated that, and we paused and recognized, the benefit of the senior man recognizing that, and because a lot of times I don't know that they do see that difference. They remember how it was for them, but not how it is today.
And I get to actually right next thing here. You may need to teach them about inflation.
Yeah.
Inflation is one of those things that happens usually in a slow and steady sort of a way in recent days, if you're in the U.S. and Brazil, But for us, it's been a slow and steady thing, and it's easy not to see and not to realize it until you look back and you measure by the decade, by a couple of decades, what the cost of living is. Good people who have been out of the workplace for a while may be shocked at what it costs you to live. You think about it, we've had that in our church. We have fellows, two of my deacons, well, one's in his 80s, one's in his 70s, and wonderful men. We've been through thick and thin together. I love them dearly. They love me. We've been very good together for a long time. With the one brother, he retired at 60. That was 22 years ago. He's had his house paid off for a very long time. And so the concept of needing X dollars to live, to raise a family in today's day and age, to keep a vehicle going, frankly, if I didn't have two vehicles, my wife and I couldn't minister. We don't have two vehicles because I work on the side. We have two vehicles because she does so much at church. We can't possibly always be in the same place. It's rare that we get to drive together. It's kind of a treat when it happens. But there are a lot of costs. So perhaps you've got somebody there in the handout, maybe they made $18,000 in their last year of full-time work. Of course, their house cost them 20 grand in 1973, but they don't translate that. Most folks don't take their wives to work and have them work for free. The pastor does that, and it's kind of expected, and frankly, those of us in this room, our wives know that and they love it, and they wouldn't have it any other way. But at the same time, my wife could not work a full-time job. If you're going to talk about what the average man makes in your area, that's one thing. I think you're better to talk about average household and to think that through, because most households around us are based on two incomes, unless the man has an exceptionally good job. They're based on two incomes. My wife is able to do a little bit of house cleaning, but that's nowhere near a full-time job. And You need to explain pastors' taxes. Again, Stewardship Services Foundation, ssfoundation.net. Those folks will do the best job for you. I encourage you, if you do not already have their booklet, order their booklet. Order enough for your church leadership. It helps people understand it. One is, you can't, if you compare your salary to anybody else's salary, it's apples and oranges. You need to explain that we're a dual status employee as a pastor. So the IRS says we work for the church, Social Security says we work for ourselves, and so of course we have to pay our own self-employment tax. So where most people, their employer pays 7.65% of their withholding, we pay it all ourselves. So add that 7.65 if you want to get those apples and oranges to line up a little bit better. There are resources that show what an average household income is for your area. You can find that out. That's a quick Google search. There are also researches that say what various kinds of clergy earn. And as I say there, in my next life, I'm going to be Episcopalian. I of course jest, but you would be amazed at how well paid they are. That's just really, I was blown away. Brother Craig Golden out in New York State used to send, once a year, he'd send an update to the churches talking about what they ought to be paying pastors. And one of the things he always cited, because if you give a big enough number, the other numbers don't look so scary, he would give what the Episcopals were paying their priests in New York State, and it was really quite good. So jokingly, going to do that next time. You might consider giving your church leadership a peek into into your finances. I don't recommend it in general. And I'll tell you very clearly what my experience was. I bared things about myself and my personal life that I never would have unless I was completely desperate, and it wasn't caught. Matter of fact, I'll be real honest, because I'm trusting that nobody gets on the web. The brothers, I said to them, you know, it was easier in a church I served in years ago where everybody from the janitor to the pastor got a 3% cost of living increase every year. Because I went years and years without a raise, and then a few years more before I got a raise, and so forth. And so they came and they offered 3%. Well, that was after 5 years of no raise, and 3% didn't really help. But they thought they were doing something very helpful to me because I had said I wanted 3%, which isn't what I had said. And in that meeting, I come in with my budget, my family budget, and I showed them without buying Christmas gifts, without taking anybody in my family on vacation, etc., without buying gifts for birthdays and all the nieces and nephews and grandnieces and nephews and so forth. This is what I need to make. And it really just kind of crickets chirped. And like I said, I have wonderful men that I've gone to battle with and would go to battle again with. When you give them a peek into your finances, people are going to second guess every pint of ice cream. They're going to second guess everything about what you do. And we always evaluate spending, other people's spending, based on our own situations. So we're going to look at things, and it's radically different. And again, if you've got retired folks whose home is paid for, etc., you've got to kind of help them get by that, and you really need somebody to do it for you. If or when your church is able or convicted, maybe they've been able, but now they're convicted to pay you enough so that you don't have to work on the side, I suggest have a transition period. Give it some time. Don't do it immediately. Part of that, well, twice in my life I've sold contracting tools. Dad, do you still have that Senko compressor I sold you?
Mm-hmm. So
Yeah.
they can.
Yeah. That was almost 30, well, it was pretty close to 30 years ago when I took my first Christian school teaching job. I sold my roof guns and I sold my compressor. I was sure I was done with that world. And now I just laugh. I wish I still had them. I did it when I took my first church. I sold a beautiful ladder rack and a big walkboard to Pastor Kinney, and I wish I had them back too. But you're stretching the church if you're going to that end, and I think that needs to be our goal. Even now, granted, some places we're in very small towns, very small churches, very poor communities. Full-time might not happen, especially if it's small and has a parsonage, that's one thing. If it's in an affluent area and it has a parsonage, that's one thing. In either case, if you have to buy a home, that makes it radically different. So think that way. Be aware of how your people are seeing things. I really would encourage a transition period. be very careful with your own finances in general, but especially in any time of transition. You're asking people to step out in faith. Maybe they have to up their giving and be more sacrificial in it. You need to be a good example throughout. And I would really, really encourage you to be very upfront about your expectation and theirs. My history, 25 years ago this July, I moved here to North Conway with my wife at our own expense for a job that, there was going to be a secular job, and then there was going to be working here at the church for nothing and living in the parsonage. We were here 6 months, and someone stood up in church and said, I want to know when the Haymans are going to get out of our parsonage. And I never knew it was supposed to be a temporary thing. And she, the lady who spoke up, had never lived in that parsonage. The day came that Pastor Brown came, I was a deacon, and I refused to let my pastor live in that parsonage. They've fixed it beautifully now, but it was a barn back then. But when I came here, I took a shellacking financially that in some ways I'm still kind of paying for. But there were things that we did that I think we did rightly. The one was when Pastor Kinney left, and I became the not really an intern pastor here at First Baptist Church.
Sorry, but I know what that is.
Yeah. So, part of that was I was not really the chairman of the deacons, and my one true title was I was the chairman of the pulpit committee. And the same lady that, by the way, if you want to come to the Prickly Church members one in a little bit, the same lady that was upset that we were still in their parsonage after 6 months, she kind of spoke out there too and said that I liked my $200 a week too much, and I was milking the job and not getting them a pastor. When in point of fact, we were looking for the right pastor. And here we are some 22, 23 years later, and that pastor's still here doing wonderful things. I think God led us the right way. There was a sensitivity here that I was aware of about how much the pastor worked. And so I sat down with the deacons, and we were very specific at my insistence. I want you to tell me how many hours you expect from me for what you're paying me. I wanted that concrete, written down, so that I knew. And I give it to you there in the handout. I give you for instance, Pastor Jones works 5 days a week on the side. Now that we're paying him 40% more, or 40% of his side income needed, we can reasonably expect that he will work only 3 days a week. And again, here, they defined it. They wanted 3 8-hour days a week from me, 24 hours, in any order I wanted to give them. But including Sunday, they wanted 24 hours for the $200 that they were going to pay me. This was like 1996 or 7, thereabouts. So they gave me the flexibility to use those hours where I wanted. I was mostly roofing, so I was weather dependent. But that was one of the best things we did here. It gave me a true freedom knowing what was expected. That was the one thing that was defined. So I knew that if I was in that range or above it, and it was typically somewhat above it, that was the nature of life. I knew that I was where I needed to be, and that I was meeting or exceeding their expectations, and that let me sleep at night. If you're going to transition out of a bivocational ministry, I suggest you don't do it all at once. My experience has been when churches try to do that all at once, very often the pastor's back to work in a year or 2. My 2 cents is, I think in most cases, I would foresee a transition. I'm prayerfully hoping for that sort of a thing myself as time goes by in my current situation. Don't skimp on study time. I remember reading about a famous piano player and world-renowned, and he said, I can practice 2 hours a week or 2 hours a day, and most people will think I'm the best piano player they've ever heard, and I'll have their respect. I can practice 4 hours a day, and accomplished piano players will be impressed with me. But for me to be happy with me is more like 6 or 8 hours a day, is what the man said. We can snow people in the pulpit, and we better not. That's the last thing that can be let go. It's the highest priority. Rightly divide the word of truth. We need to have good preaching that needs to be based on good studying. We need to be in the study. And if feeding your flock isn't at or near the very top of your priority list, and one of the greatest delights of your life, you should really think about being monovocational. And I don't mean pastoring. If it isn't what makes you tick, if it doesn't delight you, if it isn't all-encompassing for you and your absolute delight when you get into the Word, maybe this isn't the right place. We need to be careful. Also, my situation, I followed, I'm in a church that's only had one other pastor. That pastor, until his retirement days, the last 10 years of his ministry, always worked on the side. And people, I took a Friday off. I was working with a brother in the church, and I took a Friday off from a contracting job that we were doing together. And I said I needed to spend the next 2 days in the study. And he looked at me like I had two heads. He says, oh, your predecessor never would have done that. I'll talk about how he approached it. Don't think ill of him. He divided his days, weeks a little differently than the way that my brain likes to. But be careful not to skimp on your studying time. That's first and foremost. Don't let your family be last on the list. One of the wisest things my mother ever told me about my preacher father and my job as a preacher's kid, she said to my brother and I, your dad serves the Lord by serving in this church. And our ministry, a big part of our ministry, is sharing your dad with the church. That was wonderful wisdom from my mother. I remember it well. I taught my kids that way. But don't let that be an excuse to short them over and over and over again. We need to be very careful. Dr. Jim Lytle, who's now the president down at Tom and I's alma mater, and Pastor Shatney's too, what used to be BBC, told me a long time ago when Kim and I were first married that he took his wife out to dinner at least once a month and took her away at least 2 nights once a year. And he says that's some of the best advice I was ever given, and I'm passing it on. For a very, very long time we didn't take his advice. In recent years we've done that. And let me candidly tell you that when we first started going out to dinner once a month, we sat down and all she wanted to talk about was all the things we had to do in ministry. And so I set a rule, and I says, honey, we're doing this to get away, we're doing this to recharge, we're doing this to invest in us. We're not going to talk about ministry. I want you to promise me you're not going to talk about ministry. I'm going to promise you we're not going to talk about ministry. So the next time we went out, we didn't talk about ministry. You know something really horrible? We just sat and stared at each other while we chewed. We didn't have anything to talk about. We'd been so busy for so long with everybody else's needs, with everybody else's kids, with our kids, with ministry this and ministry that, we hadn't taken time. We had to learn each other all over again. We had to sit down and find things to talk about. And part of it was we needed to go out a little more often than that for a little while and to take some time and get away. My experience with her is if I took her away one night, she wouldn't relax 1 minute. If I took her away for 2 nights, she'd relax for 1 night. That was about as good as I could get. So I think it's wonderful advice. I give Brother Lytle credit, and I'll pass it along. I think we really need to be thinking that way, at the minimum. And you know, that whole debate of quality time and quantity time, to me that's like the answer, would you like pie or ice cream? The answer to that is yes. You need both. There's no, you can't call it quality time if you're in your study. You know, I work from home, and so it's deceptive. And my kids will say to me, well, you don't do anything, you sit at the computer all day. You sit at the computer all day. Well, you know, you're writing to the missionaries, and you're writing to Miss McGillicuddy who's upset about something, and you're studying for Sunday morning, you're studying for Sunday night, you're studying for prayer meeting night. You sit at the computer all day. Well, you know, you're in the house, but you're not really with them. And so find that time, find a way, I think, to delineate that time and let them know when you're there completely with them, but quality and quantity. Do your best at both. Please don't miss the good parts of bivocational ministry. Don't compartmentalize. I love to compartmentalize. I think some of it goes back to when I was in college, working for Roy Kinney, and then for myself. I would take my classes so that they were like all Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and then I'd work all day Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday doing contracting. My brain kind of, you know, I eat one food usually on my plate and then the others. My wife is rubbing off. I mix them just a little bit now. I actually let them touch, but I typically eat them in an order. And that's kind of how my head works. That's how my brain works. And so I like to compartmentalize. But what I did is I fell into a carpenter Nate, preacher Nate mentality. When I came here, or when I came to my church, anyway, getting ahead of myself. That's what happens. I don't usually type out so much for notes, and so
Stick to your compartmentalizing.
there you go. That's what I gotta try to do. One of the ladies in our church, who actually just called me this morning, is always good about inviting friends to church, and she invited another friend to church who became part of our church as well, has been there for a long time, a lot longer than me. And she talks about the first time she came to our church, and the song service was over, all the preliminaries were done, and the pastor stepped up into the pulpit to preach. And the one lady looked over at the other and says, "What's he doing?" "Well, he's going to preach." "Why is he going to do that?" "Well, it's my pastor. That's what he does. He preaches." She says, "That's not your pastor. That's my handyman." And so, the way the human brain works, I says, "Oh, well, that's too bad. His customer should have known that he was a pastor. He missed a great opportunity." And then we had a fellow come to our church, another builder. He lives in my town, and we both shop. We have basically one lumber yard. There's a Lowe's in our town, and the mom and pop stores are all long gone. And so everybody shops at Lowe's. This fellow shopped at Lowe's like I did from the year they opened back in '08. And he starts introducing me to everybody as his pastor. And some of the people he introduced me to knew I was a pastor, but a lot of the people he introduced me to, "Nate, you've been here for years. I never knew you were a pastor." And my head went down because I realized I'd been missing opportunity. Some of them knew, you know. There was a guy, he was the first the building materials and then the electrical manager. I did marital counseling with him in the aisles. He would typically walk me out to my truck when things were going bad with he and his wife, and we talked through things. We had a ministry, but there were a lot of people who didn't know. And I kind of, it's not a punch the clock thing. It's not like the the sheepdog and the coyote in the cartoons where they're terrible enemies 9 to 5 and then they punch out, good night Fred, good night Ralph. We need to keep the pastor hat on all the time, and we miss something. Working on top of doing church work, you get to meet more people to share the gospel with and to have a spiritual impact with. So don't miss that. If you're going to do it, embrace it. If you're going to do it well. And consider all of it ministry, because really the hammer swinging, the paintbrush swinging, the IV slinging, whatever it happens to be, is for God's glory, and it's to keep us in distinct, obvious ministry. But we need to keep our hat keep both hats on, if you will, and enjoy it. Fresh air and hard work are good for you. I tell people my favorite shirt is blue and white striped. I had a grandfather on my mother's side, which is the more blue collar or white collar side of my family. I had a grandfather who was an accountant by day and a bricklayer by night in downtown Chicago. He'd work on overnight crews laying bricks because he couldn't make enough doing books. I don't know if I'm white collar or blue collar at heart. I think I have a little bit of both. Maybe that's why I like that striped shirt. And working on top of ministry can buy you some street cred. It can get you credibility with hard working and those people that are sure they have the clergy pegged. I moved into my house and my neighbor came over. He says, "I hear you're a pastor. I know all about your kind. I know exactly the kind of person you are." And it took a couple years, but I think I changed his mind on that. I think he had a picture of clergy that was from his denomination, and he'd never seen any of them work like that or have as broad an interest, etc. In my experience, Midwest farmers and northern New Englanders are very wary of men with soft hands. They want to know you work. One of the things that was a culture shock for me when I moved here to North Conway is they're battle hardened, if you will. The climate, the mountains, you've got tough people up here. And you don't come with the benefit of the doubt. You come as a soft-handed flatlander, and you've got to prove your salt, or they're not going to have a lot of respect for you. That's true elsewhere. One of the professors at Baptist Bible Seminary, Dr. Williams, talked about in his first church in the Midwest. He volunteered his time 40 hours a week for one farm or another in his church on big farms. he would work all week for these fellas for nothing because he wanted them to come and minister with him. And so they couldn't say, hey, listen, we worked a hard week. He worked it right with them. He proved his sand, as he used to say, to them. And so you get some credibility. You get some opportunities. We have a project, another major building project at our church that we're working on, fixing our front porch, and we're hiring a local contractor who does regional work all over the eastern United States. And he and I got talking, and he says, I didn't realize you were the pastor when I walked up. He says, I saw that tape on your hip and how quick you were getting it off and measuring things out. I thought you were another contractor here to give a bid. I thought you were the competition until you started talking to me. And as he kept talking, he was like, he says, I think I could listen to you. When my priest tells me about real life and he doesn't have a real job and he doesn't have a wife and he doesn't have kids, I wonder, why should I listen to that? So embrace that and earn that credibility. And again, don't change hats and compartmentalize. I need to be very careful with that. If you must be bivocational, then here's some practical tips, and this is nowhere near a exhaustive list. And I think we'd be well, given the men that are in the room, I might open things up a little bit for suggestions as time lets us. As I said before, Jim Rickard and the folks at Stewardship Services Foundation are a wonderful asset to understand and teach about pastors' finances and taxes. The IRS has taken some of his definitions and made them their working definitions because he made more sense than they did. Go figure. But that's a great help. They have a booklet called The Pastor and His Income Tax. It's updated for each tax year. You can get that at ssfoundation.net. Everything there is on a love gift basis. It doesn't cost you anything. You can download the booklet or you can order the booklet, hard copy. If you fill out their questionnaires, they'll do your taxes for you. I highly recommend them. They also do financial seminars at your church. I automate all the bill paying I can. Not everybody's comfortable with that, but I write checks to the church and to the town of Ware for my water bill. That's it. I don't write checks to pay utilities. Checks are expensive, and finding the time to do it. So one of the things I do that buys me a little time is I automate my bill paying. I try to make as many of the calls as I can on the road with a good Bluetooth. Mass actually doesn't have a hands-free law yet. They're probably going to have it soon. I'm amazed they don't have it yet. I can't stand to hold that phone up there all day, but I get a good Bluetooth headset, and the quality might not be perfect, but I try to get as many calls done there as I can. Use your road time. If you have any kind of a commute at all, short or long. Ephesians 5:18 literally is be filling yourself with spiritual things. Listen to things that have eternal value. A Bible, online Bibles or audio Bibles, audio books, good preaching if you can find it on your computer or podcast or otherwise. Be listening to something good. Use road time to mull over Scripture, to meditate on the Word of God. I live in the middle of Massachusetts, and radio stations are funny. I love sports. I love sports radio. We have WEEI, which is a pretty good sports radio station. They come out of Springfield. They come out of Providence, Rhode Island. They come out of Boston. And so I have 3 different channels that I can listen to. When I'm in West Brookfield, 5 minutes from my church, none of those 3 channels come in. That's the dead zone where I can't get any of them. And Christian radio is hit and miss in the little hills and valleys too. I spend a lot of time in a quiet car or a quiet truck, and I try to use it thinking things over. My friends would tell you my ADD keeps me from ever being bored on the road. But we might think through our preaching plans. We might think of our decisions. We might mull over how we're going to answer that difficult letter we just got, or how we're going to deal with a counseling situation, etc. Use a smartphone to dictate notes or set reminders while you're on the road. It's a great thing. That's part of this. Nate could probably speak to better than I can. He's an Evernote aficionado, and I think you keep pretty much everything in there, don't you?
Pretty close.
It's a good thing to do. I find I don't lose things if they're on the computer like I do when they're in paper. Personally, I'm kind of selective in my professional reading. I think if I was truly full-time in ministry, I would do a lot more reading about current events, current trends in biblical teaching, ways to warn the flock and so forth. I do very little of that. A lot of what I do is I listen to the reviews at our Shepherd's Haven conference down in Pennsylvania in March. If the brothers read it and say it's not worth the paper it's written on, I don't read it. If they read it and say, hey, this really meant something to me, this was a great help, I make a note of it and I shorten my list that way. Take note of the things that rob your time. There are things that we do all the time, just they become our habits. I like looking at things for efficiency's sake. One of the first friends I made when I came here to North Conway was a fellow that managed the friendlies in town. And part of that is we went to Woodsman's Day down at Camp Northfield and we split wood together, and we both had an eye to making the job efficient as it could be. Find those things that rob you of your efficiency and do away with them. Make some shifts. I do like to compartmentalize. I do what I can to stack similar tasks together. If you remember daytimer organizers back in the day, they had quite the following before the tech world, kind of eclipsed them. But they talked about that: make all your calls in one afternoon, write all your emails at once, set a time for correspondence. One of my pastors back in the day never took Monday off. He says, why should I take a day off when I'm too tired to have any fun? So he came in on Monday mornings, and that was communication time for him. Pardon me, that was when he responded to letters and emails. That was when he made phone calls and so forth. So I like to put things together. I find that helps me. Speaking to the whole working as a carpenter thing, for me, I need that flexibility. My church is large enough that there are times, the last 2 months, I gave the Kinneys 1 day. I wanted to give them 3. I worked 9 hours the month before that on the side, and I had gone 2 months before that without doing any side work. So my bank account's getting hungry, but ministry hasn't let me. So I need work that can be flexible to it, and then I need, the flexibility. God's been very good to me. I've never once torn a roof off and had a roof down to bare wood and had to go to the hospital. That's the grace of God is all that is. I like to split my days up. I know some of the brothers, Tom, didn't you used to work, just used to define it like 2 days or 3 days?
I compartmentalized that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I think is ideal.
Mm-hmm.
And if my work wasn't so seasonal, I try to be better at that.
Another thing is to make sure we're getting a fair rate and not
Yes.
undercut our price.
Yes. That's when you work for church people, especially. My experience especially when I first came to Pilgrim, so much of my work was for church people, and they thought they were being good to me, and they were, but I was trying to be good to them too, and so I wasn't charging enough. And that's another place where people don't understand the overhead. I have 4 licenses in my pocket for the state of Mass. I have to have 2 of them just to pull a roof
Or the
permit.
competition's price.
Yeah, right. And that's one of the things I like about roofing. I don't like that it breaks me down physically, but I do like the fact that I can always be under the market and still make money.
It's a good thing to just tell people, get 2 or 3 bids and now
Yes.
on the bid.
That's right.
In a sense, I'll give you a better price.
Yeah.
This isn't a favor, it's a job.
Yeah.
Well, that's-
Right, now
Right.
they'll see, boy, this is where it's at,
Yeah,
and
you're right.
you're giving them a percent.
I had a friend that was, I have a friend, I forgot, I printed mine all such large print that I've got 4 pages to year 2. And anyway, I got more to say than I thought I did. I had a mechanic friend who would charge his Christian friends full price less 10%. Full price less 10%. That in his place, that was how that worked. I'm at the place now where I have an established business. I have people that recommend me. I have a reputation. I get recommended by people even outside the church. I finally got outside that circle, and that's a big, big help to me. But I came to realize and get convicted that when I don't charge enough, I'm robbing the ministry
And the family.
and the family. So getting educated enough to know, Pastor Kinney's helped me to find good resources that talk about how much to charge for your work, etc.
Because that can reduce the hours possibly too, depending on.
Sleep, eat, and breathe. There was a movie out a little while ago, Mom's Night Out. It was a lot of the same people that did Courageous and Fireproof and so forth. It had a lot of Christian undertone to it. My kids particularly liked the pastor's wife that was played by Patricia Heaton. and she didn't know how to navigate the autocorrect or the autofill on her texting, and chicken noodle soup turned into chicken poodle poop, things like that. But part of the thing there was for a young mother to take care of herself, to put her oxygen mask on first, because she was no good to anybody else. She was no good to her husband if she wasn't taking care of herself. She was no good to her kids. We need to take care of ourselves too. We need a model stewardship in front of our church. We need to be generous with our giving, even as we're generous with our time. It's easy to fall into the trap. I already give so much time. Do I really have to give money too? Luke 6:38 talks about giving, large measure, pressed down, flowing over. With the measure you measure out, it'll be measured back to you. We need to be careful to do just that, even as we're working. I'm in a situation now where sometimes with church people that are really close friends and very, very faithful, I've done a couple of roofs and I have a couple to do that are quite discounted. I couldn't have afforded to do this back in the day, but last year I had enough of roof type work that I could squeeze in a couple of church people at a greatly reduced rate. Part of the deal is, listen, I'll do this for you for this price, but don't tell anybody what you paid. I love being able to do that for the super faithful who've been so good to me. Frugal living, and again, I think Pastor Shadney could teach this part way better than I can. Not everybody agrees on this, and I think for very good reason there are different approaches. You can take the cash-only approach, you put it all in an envelope, this is what we have for gas, this is what we have for groceries, etc. And record keeping can be nightmarish. You know, if you lose cash, there's no way to get it back. It's gone. Same with gift cards. But you get a very, very good idea of where your money goes if you do that. If you keep an envelope system, hard and fast, that's the best way to do it, and absolutely not spend what you don't have. Also, my view is the maximum cash back approach. I have 2 cards that pay me 2% back on everything. I have a gas card for 5%, a utility card for 5%, a grocery card for 6%.
And the wife for 100%.
I set all these up to automatically pay the balance in full at the end of the month. If you cannot and have a hard time getting the balance in full paid at the end of the month, by all means don't touch a credit card. But if you can do that, I've made remarkable money on cash back. Clip a coupon, stack your savings, grow a garden, hang your laundry, change your own oil. It's not what you make, it's what you spend. And my father-in-law has demonstrated that as well as anybody I've ever made. I think people would be gobsmacked if they knew how little he made in his life with what the Lord's blessed him with, but a lot of that was just being careful and not spending what you don't have. Make a hobby out of saving money and making money. I play with cashback cards. I'll buy gift cards at a discount. I'll find coupons. I'll buy on sale. To me, it's a game. I have fun with it. The government can't really tax you for saving money. They can tax you for breathing. They can tax you for water. They can charge you for everything. They really can't charge you for saving. All they can charge you is tax on the interest. And how much interest did you really make last year? But I think frugal living is the biggest part no matter what we do for work. If you would like anything else from me specific about credit cards, anything else specific about resources other than what I already gave you, please let me know. And we've eaten our time, we better pray. Thank you, Lord, so much for the day. Thank you for these brothers that came. We pray, Lord, that we were help to each other as we talk things through a little bit. And Lord, again, that we would honor you in our finances, that our churches would do the same, and that we'd give you the glory in it all in Christ's name.